a series of topics have been suggested to me. They cover they're all interesting and important and cover about anything one can think of easily enough for many, many talks and discussions. Time is pretty limited, and since my wife knows I talk too much, she actually got me a pocket watch to try to shut me up. So I'll try to keep to the allotted time, which means I'll only touch on a few things. I'll pick a few that seem to me of particular relevance or significance, but don't feel bound by that for the discussion period afterwards. Raise questions as you feel fit. One issue that's surely of significance is the expectations of the most powerful sectors. So let's start with that. So take, say, the president, speaking of what he calls the war on terror. Actually, before I go on, I should say that he's using the word terror in a kind of a technical sense, not in accord with official definitions in the U.S. Code and Army manuals and so on. He's referring to a special category of terror, namely the kind of terror that they carry out against us, not the terror that we carry out against them, which is typically much greater. That's a convention. He's not inventing it. That's a convention which is unchallengeable. You can look at the massive literature on this and see it. I'll keep to it, but not without noting some rather serious objections. Of course, it's totally disgraceful and pure moral cowardice, but it is the convention, so when I say terror, I mean that subcategory. Well, speaking of the so-called war on terror, the president says there's no telling how many wars it will take to secure freedom in the homeland, meaning freedom from terror. And that comment is quite correct. It's fair. The threats are limitless. They're everywhere. They're at home. The anthrax attack illustrated that. Many experts considered it much more ominous even than 9/11. It's been traced back to a federal laboratory in the United States. So if you want to fight wars, there are plenty of places to bomb. Furthermore, all of this has been known for a long time. It's been known for a long time that with contemporary technology, the rich and the powerful have lost their monopoly of large-scale violence. They still maintain an enormous preponderance, but it's no longer a monopoly. So a couple of years before 9/11, technical material was circulating about this. One technical paper pointed out that it made an assessment, a risk assessment, and assessed that a well-planned effort to smuggle weapons of mass destruction, meaning nuclear weapons, into the United States would have a 90% probability of success, far higher than a missile attack with or without missile defense, even if it worked. That's sometimes called America's Achilles heel. That's the title of a collection of technical essays by specialists about 4 years ago, published by MIT Press, giving a kind of a laundry list, some guidebook to terrorists on various kinds of horrifying atrocities that they could carry out without much trouble. That's been obvious, certainly since 1993, when radical Islamist groups connected to those, maybe part of those organized and trained and armed by the CIA and its associates in the 1980s, came very close to blowing up the World Trade Center with more ambitious plans. The FBI building, the UN, tunnels under New York. Happens they didn't make it, but building engineers at the time pointed out that with a little better planning, they might have killed tens of thousands of people. Since then, it surely has been evident to anyone with eyes open, let alone the technical literature, that things like this are very likely to happen. You can't predict when and where, but something. The fact that an attack of the anticipated kind was successful on September 11th, in fact, horrifyingly so, actually, if you think about it, it doesn't actually change the assessment of risk very much, maybe at all. And the risk is quite serious. And it's known. It's also known that there are ways to increase the risk substantially, and that there are ways to reduce it. And those ways are known too. So, for example, if you're interested in increasing the risk, the CIA gave some advice a couple of weeks ago. They pointed out that one way to increase the risk of terror is to attack Iraq. They concluded that it's very unlikely that Iraq is now associated with any of the Islamic terrorist groups, but that if Iraq is attacked, it will very likely spawn a new generation of terrorists bent on revenge, and it also may set off terrorist acts that are already planned, perhaps planned as a deterrent or as revenge. It's been discussed by very mainstream, sober, respected scholars in the field of international relations and related areas. They've been pointing out for some time that U.S. adventurism is driving potential targets to develop weapons of mass destruction, because that's the only way to deter U.S. violence. I happen to be quoting Kenneth Waltz, one of the most distinguished of them, but there are many others. You read that in the mainstream establishment publications. And the same is true of terrorism. For potential targets of U.S. violence, there aren't many deterrents available, and one of the few is terror, one of the few measures of deterrence that's available against a state that is widely regarded as a menace to itself and to mankind as it pursues unilateral world domination through absolute military superiority under a radical nationalist leadership which regards world opinion with contempt. As you can see, I'm quoting. In this case, I'm quoting from a senior associate of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Anatole Yevin, writing in a leading British journal, London Review. Even the national press in the United States, which tends to be highly supportive of power, recognizes, I'm quoting again, that the world is more concerned about the unbridled use of American power than it is about the threat posed by Saddam Hussein. Happens to be a lead story in the press, national press, a couple days ago. Rather significantly, this is true of the regional states, the states right around Iraq. They're afraid, all right, but they're afraid of the United States, not of Saddam Hussein. They despise Saddam Hussein, but they know that there's not much he can do. On the other hand, there's plenty that the U.S. can do, and it worries them. That's even true of Kuwait and Iran, two countries that were invaded brutally by Saddam Hussein at a time when he was a favored U.S. ally. That is, an ally of the people who are now in power, who are mostly from that administration. Just in brief, the threat of this category of terrorism is serious, and there are ways to increase it. And those ways, in fact, are being pursued right now with very fierce dedication. It's not, of course, that Rumsfeld and Powell and the rest of them want to encourage terrorism, but rather they judge it to be insignificant in comparison with more serious goals, and that merits some thought. I'll come back to it. There are also ways to reduce terrorism. They're known too, even aside from the most obvious way to reduce terrorism, and that's to stop participating in it. But I can't talk about that because that violates the convention, so I'll put that aside. Keeping to the convention, one way to reduce terrorism, which is well known, is careful police work, and that's successful. It was very successful recently in Germany, primarily, much more than anywhere else. Germany recently broke up a major al-Qaeda cell through police investigation. In contrast, bombing Afghanistan apparently had little effect on terrorism and may actually have increased the threat, according to U.S. intelligence, reported a couple of months ago in the New York Times, and I noticed in this morning's national press as well. Well, that's not a great surprise, actually. The role of Afghanistan in terrorism, including 9/11, is still pretty obscure. How obscure was pointed out by the head of the FBI in June, Robert Mueller, when he was testifying before the Senate Investigating Committee. And he informed them, this is 8 months after the bombing of Afghanistan, he informed them that the FBI now believes, that's his word, the FBI now believes that the plot may have been hatched in Afghanistan, but was planned and implemented and financed in Germany and the United Arab Republic, Emirates. Well, that's what's now believed. So it isn't too surprising if bombing Afghanistan didn't have much effect and may actually have increased the threat, as U.S. intelligence now concludes. So what was the purpose? Why do it in that case? Well, here's one possibility discussed by a reputable source. Abdul Haq is one of the most highly respected of the Afghan leaders who opposed and fought the Taliban, highly respected in the United States, incidentally, and also by the new Karzai government. And like quite a lot of other Afghan opponents of the Taliban, he was bitterly opposed to the bombing and condemned it and called on the United States to end it. His argument was that the bombing was, apart from destroying the country, was undermining efforts of his and others to overthrow the hated Taliban regime from within. And he went on to give his judgment as to why the U.S. was doing it. He said the United States is trying to show its muscle, score a victory, and scare everyone in the world. Well, if that's a correct analysis, it was successful, at least in that. Well, putting such analyses to the side, one way to reduce terror is known, careful police work, not just in this case. Another way to reduce terror is to pay some attention to the people who have the most experience in the matter. So take, for example, Israel has plenty of experience. There's the General Security Services, the secret police that runs the occupied territories, Shabak. The head of the Shabak, recently retired, Ami Ayalon, pointed out very recently that those who want victory against terror want an unending war unless they are willing to address underlying grievances. That's correct, and Bush planners understand it very well without hearing it from him, but they don't want to address the underlying grievances. In contrast, an unending war, even if with more terror, is acceptable, and in fact, even more than acceptable. It's even necessary, essential. I'm quoting again for radical nationalists who have adopted the classic modern strategy of an endangered right-wing oligarchy, which is to divert mass discontent into nationalism through fears of external enemies that they conjure up. It's the same senior associate of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and is one of the reasons why the world, a large part of it, regards the United States as a menace to itself and to mankind as it continues on this project. And there's really no secret about it. See it all around you. It's been a very effective tactic in the current elections. It's managed to terrify the public into overlooking what the government's doing to them and voting fear for somebody who will protect them from imagined enemies. And it's going to be even more important for the next presidential campaign next year. Take, say, Karl Rove, Bush's main political advisor. I mean, the last thing he wants next year, is for people to be paying attention to their jobs and their pensions and health care and Social Security and destruction of an environment in which their children might survive, or the extraordinary concentration of wealth that's being fostered with real dedication by the extremist radical nationalists in charge. That would be a disaster. Rather, what he wants is for the population to be singing praises to the heroic leader who has miraculously rescued them from a unimaginably powerful foe, colossal power like some kind of Martian, and by then we'll be off on some other grand adventure. I mean, any political leader with any sense at all understands that when you're carrying out an assault against the general population and seeking to control the world by unilateral military force. All of this, furthermore, is just second nature to the people now in power, to the Bush planners. Remember, they're mostly recycled Reaganites. They come from the Reagan-Bush administration 20 years ago, and they're following pretty much the same routine, if you look at it, including the war on terror, which was not declared on September 11th, but it was declared 20 years earlier by the same people with the same rhetoric and very much many of the same people in leading positions. We know what happened then. At least we should. One example was just given, Archbishop Romero. The decade of the 1980s, that horrifying decade, opened with his assassination. He had become a voice for the voiceless, as he was called by his associates. He was assassinated by elite units closely connected to and supported by the United States, and that just set off a decade of horror in Central America and elsewhere, the Middle East, Africa, all under the huge amount of horrifying international terrorism and destruction, all under the pretext of a war on terror by the same people. So you want to have, elementary sanity dictates that if we want to learn about what's going on now, we would look at what happened then, but that topic is also under a ban, like our terrorism generally. You can check the vast literature on the war on terror since it was redeclared by the same people on September 11th, and you can easily determine how much this highly relevant, very recent history has been discussed. Well, put that aside. Clearly that's what all of this is, as I say, second nature to these guys. They did the same thing 20 years ago. You may, well, you're too young to recall, but your parents do, that 20 years ago there was another brave cowboy leader in the White House. He was cringing in fear in the White House, surrounded by tanks to protect him from Libyan hitmen who were roaming the streets of Washington. And a few years later, he was wailing about how Gaddafi wants to expel America from the world, no less, and warning that the Nicaraguan army is only 2 days marching time from Texas. So we have to huddle in fear, and they're planning to carry out, to conquer the hemisphere, following a script from Mein Kampf. That's George Shultz. He was the administration moderate, the Colin Powell of the day. And a national emergency was called in the United States because of the threat to our security and existence posed by the government of Nicaragua. So if you think we're in trouble now with Saddam Hussein, remember it's been a lot worse in the recent past. And it went on and on, Hispanic narco-traffickers, almost anything you can think of. At that time, frightened Americans were an object of considerable wonder in the world and not ridicule sometimes. And the government inspired plenty of fear. A huge anti-nuclear movement developed in Europe, partly in fear of Reaganite fanaticism. And that's understandable, and now that the same people are back again, now without any deterrent, there's even greater fear. So it's not surprising that much of the world regards the U.S. as a menace to itself and to mankind. Well, let's go back to, nor is it surprising that they're following the same policies. That only makes sense. So back to Ami Ayalon and how to reduce terror, if we're interested, namely address the underlying grievances. He, of course, was speaking of Israel-Palestine, where the only solution of the problem of terror is to offer an honorable solution to Palestinians respecting their right of self-determination. Well, that happens to be the conclusion of the head of the Israeli secret police that runs the territories, but I was quoting somebody else, namely one of his predecessors, Yehoshaphat Harkabi, who was the head of Israeli military intelligence and a leading Arabist, and that was 20 years ago. That was after another shocking outburst of army and settler violence in the occupied territories. And bear in mind that that was at a time when Israel retained its immunity from any retaliation from within the territories to the quite brutal and harsh practices it was conducting there, and also to its program of stealing land and resources. All of this is thanks to crucial U.S. support all the way through, as it is today. Otherwise, it's totally impossible. That immunity from retaliation lasted until quite recently, so therefore the violence and oppression and atrocities were considered quite unproblematic by elite American opinion. That brings us back to the definition of terror. It's only what they do to us. It's not what we do to them, which is typically far worse, just for reasons of the amount of force available. But it's unproblematic for those who give patriotism a bad name. Terrorism is often called a weapon of the weak. That's just not true. Like most weapons, it's a weapon of the strong primarily, except they don't call it terror. They call it counter-terror or something like that. Well, the observations of Ayalon and Harkabi, they generalize in quite obvious ways. And in serious scholarship, there's just no question about it. It's recognized, quoting now, that unless the social, political, and economic conditions that spawned al-Qaeda and other associated groups are addressed, the United States and its allies will continue to be targeted by terrorists. Same point. Want to reduce terrorism, address the underlying grievances. It's true whether it's the IRA or radical Islamists or whoever you like. It's a truism. It's only intellectuals who are posturing before the galleries who sink to such mindless absurdities as the claim that explanation is justification, or who claim that whatever is going on, it's all their fault. We don't play any role by definition because we're so good or even magnificent. That's the common stance of the powerful right through the ages. Nothing new here. We're just replaying the same ugly and disgraceful record. In fact, you have to insist on this so strongly that even the government record, the internal U.S. government record at the very highest levels, has to be rigorously suppressed, and is. You can check again. So take George Bush's pathetic question, why do they hate us? Answer, because we're so good. But the question was, he's not the first person to have asked the question, and anyone who wants to understand these issues should know that. The question was asked long ago, 45 years before, by President Eisenhower in 1958. This is an internal discussion, but it's been public for years. I wrote about it 10 years ago when it was declassified. In 1958, Eisenhower discussed with his staff what he called the campaign of hatred against us by the people in the Arab world. And the staff, the National Security Council, highest planning body, gave the reasons. The reasons are a recognition in that region that the United States supports brutal and repressive governments and blocks democracy and development, and we do it because of our interest in controlling the oil resources of the region. That continues right into the present. Now we don't have secret documents, but we have public investigations, and they lead the same results, exacerbated by particular policies. All of this, incidentally, has absolutely nothing to do with hating America. These are mostly people who like Americans, who greatly admire American freedom and democracy, who participate in, these are managers of multinational corporations. They have no problem with what's called globalization or any of that stuff. What they hate is U.S. government policies that block democracy and development and support brutal and repressive regimes in order to ensure control over the resources of the region. And that goes on right up to the present. There's a wave of anger in Pakistan, for example, over U.S. support for a harsh military regime which is clearly undermining democracy. The same is true in Central Asia, and it's all over Egypt, all over the place. You have to be blind not to see it, perfectly blind, purposely blind, because it's not hidden. The resources of the region are not a joke either. Back in the 1940s, in 1945, the State Department described the resources of the Persian Gulf as a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history. It's not a small thing. The U.S. was, of course, committed immediately after the war to taking control of that stupendous resource and material prize, and did so. The problem is not access. It's important to understand. It's control. The material prize yields a huge flow of wealth to the United States in various ways, and the strategic power translates into an instrument of world control. Now, that's quite critical for understanding U.S. goals in Iraq. As the second largest oil reserves in the world, second to Saudi Arabia, access has never been a problem, and it isn't a problem now. It's control. There's a lot of misunderstanding about that, and it's important to think it through carefully. Well, let me return to the expectations of the powerful. Luckily for us, they tell us about it. An important public document produced about 2 years ago by the, 2.5, almost 3 years ago by the National Intelligence Council. That's the collection of the highest intelligence agencies along with academic specialists and others. They have a publication called Global Trends 2015. So what do they expect for the next 15 years? Here's the main prediction. What they call globalization will continue on course. Its evolution will be rocky, with increasing financial volatility and a widening economic divide. Just think about that for a minute. According to theoretically, globalization is supposed to lead to convergence, integrated market with a single price and wage. But they're predicting the opposite, a widening economic divide. That means less globalization in the technical sense, but more in the doctrinally preferred sense. That is, the people who matter will do just fine, and the rest sort of not our department. More financial volatility means slower growth, harming mainly the poor. Actually, that lifts the veil on another aspect of foreign policy, a rather striking feature for the past 25 years or so, what's called neoliberal policy, or sometimes globalization. It's been accompanied this period by a marked deterioration in standard economic measures right across the board: growth of the economy, productivity, investment, even trade, and stagnation for most of the population, but a huge concentration of wealth. That's sharply true in the richest country in the world, us, but it's pretty general for the countries that followed the rules. Those who didn't made out much better. It's rather striking that the countries that followed the rules most rigorously, like Latin America, suffered the most, while those that ignored them, like East Asia, managed to escape the general decline. Well, there's a lot more to say about this, including the tremendous attack on democracy that all this involves. We're seeing it right now in Brazil, but there's no time for that. The conclusion of the powerful is that we should extend and intensify the global policies that have had these consequences. Happens to be giving rise to major popular struggles throughout the world. That's some of the most important developments going on now, but again, have to put it aside. Well, let's return to the expectations. What are going to be the effects of the widening economic divide? Here's the National Intelligence Council. As globalization proceeds, deepening economic stagnation will foster political, ethnic, ideological, and religious extremism, along with violence, much of it directed against the United States. So we're back to the so-called war on terror and underlying grievances, which have to be addressed unless we prefer to more terrorist atrocities and an unending war. And as I've been trying to point out, that's a rational choice for a radical nationalist extremist leadership which has the plans that it does. Well, it's interesting that the same assumptions are made by military planners. And just to indicate how narrow the spectrum is, I'll take some from Clinton-era documents. So there's another public document, actually intended for the public, came out in 1997, published by Clinton's Space Command, called Vision for 2020. What do they expect to happen in 20 years? They predict a growing gap between the haves and the have-nots. The have-nots are going to have to be controlled. It's the same prediction as the National Intelligence Council about the consequences of deepening stagnation and a widening economic divide. And that's a good part of the thinking behind the vast expansion of U.S. military power. Even before September 11th, it completely outweighed any possible combination of adversaries or allies. September 11th gave a pretext for a sharp increase, which is completely unrelated to terrorism, but is closely related to global dominance and to controlling the extremists who will follow from the stagnation and widening economic divide. The Visions document gives an interesting history of this. They point out that in the past, countries had to develop armies for self-defense. The example that they use is the United States, where the army was necessary in self-defense for the peaceful people who were spreading across the continent and taking over half of Mexico, and they had to be defended from the indigenous population who they were expelling and exterminating, or those who were irrationally trying to keep Mexico. That's called self-defense, and that's why we needed armies. Then they point out that navies were needed to protect commercial interests and investments. Now there's a new frontier, space, so we got a militarized space to protect U.S. business interests and investments, and of course to control the growing number of have-nots as deepening stagnation fosters extremism and violence. That's the war on terror, which of course will be another terrorist war. The most ominous development is the militarization of space. It's worth discussing. Again, not much time, but it is extremely dangerous. It might lead to total devastation, in fact, just by unintended accident. It's not unlikely, in fact. And again, the world is very frightened. There is an Outer Space Treaty, 1967, which bans military use of space. In the last couple of years, the United Nations General Assembly has been reaffirming the treaty. The reason is they know the U.S. intends to violate it. And that's approved unanimously with 2 opposed, the United States and Israel, which is really 1 opposed, because Israel's become basically a U.S. military base. The same is true of the UN Disarmament Commission. Meets in the last couple of years, it's been meeting, last Clinton years and since, trying to do the same thing, but can't get it through. The U.S. won't allow it. In fact, just last week, October 23rd, the United Nations, again, the First Committee, which is essentially the General Assembly, approved 2 resolutions. One was a resolution to ban weapons in space. A second was a resolution to reaffirm the 1925 Geneva Convention that bans chemical weapons. Once again, 2 countries opposed, the U.S. and Israel. They both abstained, and a U.S. abstention amounts to a veto, actually a double veto. For one thing, the decision is vetoed, and secondly, it's vetoed from the media and from history. And in fact, everything I've just described has been vetoed in the second sense. What happened last week, there was no report, as usual. And that's pretty serious, banning weapons in outer space and reaffirming a 1925 Convention against chemical weapons. Highly timely, too. Takes some discipline to suppress all this. But the point is that editors and commentators probably understand, without anybody telling them, it's just not a good idea to allow citizens to know of plans that may bring to an end biology's only experiment with what's called higher intelligence. Well, a lot of this is disguised as missile defense, but defense, as usual, means offense, and everyone understands that. U.S. military analysts agree with Chinese military analysts that missile defense, quoting them, is not simply a shield, but it's also a sword. It's an enabler of action. Missile defense will provide the United States with absolute freedom in using or threatening to use force in international relations, cementing U.S. hegemony, and making Americans the masters of the world. Actually, I'm quoting military analysts in the liberal and conservative press. They're not very different. That's the reason behind the reasoning behind the national security strategy that was released a couple of weeks ago, and that seriously intensified the growing fears of the United States throughout the world. Well, let's come to the Middle East, which is the focus of present concern. What are the expectations there? The National Intelligence Council predicts a rising demand for energy, which they say will undermine the Kyoto protocols, whether people sign them or not, and will lead to increased global warming. One of the main arguments for a war in Iraq, as I'm sure you know, is that once the U.S. regains control, it can increase production, lower prices, increase the rising demand, make sure there's twice as many cars on Milwaukee streets, and escalate the destruction of the environment. It's another threat to survival, but it's entirely rational within a lunatic framework. The National Intelligence Council, of course, talks about the Persian Gulf. They say the Persian Gulf region, that's Iraq and Saudi Arabia and Iran and so on, that will see large increases in oil production capacity and will rise in importance to world energy markets. So the U.S. must control it, as it has since World War II. They go on to say that the U.S. itself will not rely on Middle East oil. It's going to rely on more stable sources in the Atlantic Basin, West Africa, Latin America, and Canada. And that's nothing new. After World War II, the United States did not rely on Middle East oil. In fact, North America was the leading producer until about 1970. It's been mostly Venezuela since, importing to the U.S. But this never influenced the commitment to control the stupendous source of strategic power and the greatest material prize in world history, or even such secondary prizes as Central Asia. The goal is control and not access. That's important. The war in Iraq, which is planned and will come unless we stop it, pretexts are offered. They're pretty hard to take seriously. I can come back to them if you like. But there certainly are reasons. One reason is the regaining control of the stupendous source of strategic power, at least this part of it, and the material prize. 9/11 gave a pretext for that. It's a long-standing goal. And domestic political considerations, the kind that I mentioned, they dictate the timing. It's got to be this winter. Can't wait another year, because it has nothing to do with the mushroom cloud that Condoleezza Rice talks about. Nobody sane believes in that. But it has more mundane reasons. It has to do with the fact that there's going to be a presidential campaign. Karl Rove can figure it out. There is a security concern, a significant one, security imperative. but it's not securing the population from threat. It has to do with securing a domestic program, a program of service to very narrow and unusually corrupt sectors of corporate power, along with a continuing assault on most of the population, which is very serious, and the pursuit of global dominance based on absolute military superiority. That has to be secured for another 4 years, so a war against Iraq makes sense. By next year, the next phase will probably be underway, maybe Iran. That war may have already started. The Israeli Air Force, which is not small, it's a small country, but remember it's a U.S. military base, which makes it a powerful country. Their own assessment, the IDF, the Israeli Army, their analysts assess their Air Force and Navy. They say that they are more powerful, they're larger and more technically advanced than any NATO power. About over 10% of them are now permanently based in eastern Turkey, where they're flying over at the Iranian border. They're based in these huge U.S. military bases in eastern Turkey, which are bases for nuclear-armed planes. And they're thinking about the next war, Iran. Iraq's over. The Egyptian press refers to what they call an axis of evil. They're referring to the U.S., Israel, and Turkey. It's not a bad usage. I mean, unlike the one invented by Bush's speechwriters, this is a real axis. Iran and Iraq have been at war for 20 years. It's not an axis. North Korea was tossed in to make it look as though it's not a war against Muslims. But this is a real axis, and there's plenty of evil to go around, and they're at work. Iran is a likely next target. And there's a much more far-reaching plans. You can read about them in U.S. scholarly sources, although the best place really is the Israeli press. It's generally quite reliable, and it's particularly informative now because of very close links between the high-level Bush planners and the extreme right in Israel. I'm not referring to Ariel Sharon, but the groups to the right of Sharon. So Richard Pearl is a top planner, and Douglas Feith, another one. 5-6 years ago, they were writing position papers for Benjamin Netanyahu, who's to the right of Sharon. He's his right-wing critic, way out on the extreme. These plans are available. You can read about them. They're pretty frightening, and they're frightening even to U.S. military planners, the serious ones. Recently were sharply criticized by one of the best known of them, Anthony Cordesman, who's a strategic analyst, one of the most prestigious of them, who concentrates primarily on the Middle East, and he warned the government not to be caught up in the plan, I'm quoting him, in the plans of sillier armchair strategists and more vocally irresponsible hardliners. He's referring to Pearl and Feith and others who are very close to the center of power, and Cordesman himself is about as hardline as you can get within any sector that retains some elements of sanity. And this, again, is another indication of why the world is so deeply concerned about U.S. power and its exercise. Well, there's a lot more to say about this, but my wife's watch tells me I should shut up. So I'll just end with the good news, and there is good news. The good news is that we are very highly privileged. We're not in a position of people like Archbishop Romero, who are going to be assassinated by U.S.-supported state terrorists. Or we're not like the people in two of the countries I just visited in the last few months, Turkey and Colombia, the scenes of some of the worst atrocities of the horrible 1990s still going on, all thanks to massive U.S. support in military, economic, and doctrinal. The doctrinal support comes from silence, so you don't read about it. We just contribute to the atrocities. And there are people there, kind of like us, in fact, very prominent people, leading writers, artists, priests in Colombia, academics, human rights activists, who are constantly struggling very courageously for things like freedom of speech or for defense of people who are millions of people who are being subjected to vicious, miserable oppression and destruction, thanks to us. And they face dangers. They face assassination, like Archbishop Romero and not a few others. Or prison and torture and other pretty serious consequences. We don't face any of this. We are uniquely privileged. We have the means to determine whether the ominous tendencies that are frightening the world will continue, or whether policy takes a different course, a more constructive course, and the enormous wealth and power that we have in our hands will be used to build instead of to destroy.